Hey guys, it's Rick again, and this is the second part of a three-part series on creative financing. Today we're talking all about creative financing terms and the three different creative financing techniques you can take down most creative financing deals. And we're gonna get really into the weeds on this, and the idea is to keep this super simple that anybody can understand and apply this knowledge. Guys, do me a favor, make sure you smash that like button, hit that subscribe button so other people can find out how to get started in creative financing. So today we're talking all about creative financing terms, and I find a lot of this is talked over. So let's break it down to the rudimentary so you can understand it, because if you don't understand the terminology, it's hard to apply the three different types of techniques to do the most basic creative financing deals. So what I want to do is break down and take some of the challenges we have to deal in wholesaling and show you how you're going to have to deal with in creative financing. So I'm going to give you a visual representation. We have to understand in the United States, real estate's really simple. Banks like to give real estate loans because it is an appreciating asset, and as long as they're protected, meaning you put some money down or the values are there, they're willing to give a loan for people that make good income and they're responsible, and they make the people personally sign. So they secure it to the property and they secure it to the individual. So what I want to do is break down how this actually works, because if you have to understand this, because basically you're taking over some of the bank's due diligence process and understanding how do you secure people's interest when loaning money out in real estate. So we have to understand it. So let's even break it down to a simpler basis. In wholesaling, you have to understand the difference on how foreclosures work in every state. Most of the 48 mainland states that we deal with, the crazy part is every state almost has like a different procedures. Not really. They're really broken down into two categories. One is judicial and one is non-judicial. Importance of knowing this is on how banks and how us as creative financing are going to secure our deals. First of all, you got to recognize what states you predominantly do this, and some of you guys are doing this in your own backyard. Some of you are going to do it nationwide. So I want to give you a visual breakdown of how this works and how it looks. It's just easier to write it down. So let's break it down here. There is judicial and non-judicial. Now guys, these are the laws in the courts. This is how, and we're specifically talking about real estate laws and basically how people secure their interest. So you have to decide which state are you in. When I'm done with this graphic, I'm going to show you a physical representation of which state is which so you can understand. What's the primary difference though? Let's stick to the task at hand. What's the difference between judicial and non-judicial? So I'm in the state of Florida. I'm in a judicial state, which basically says when I buy a property, for the bank to take it back, they have to go through a formal courtroom proceeding. That's what's judicial. A non-judicial means basically they can accelerate the foreclosure without actually going to court. Some of them still go to court. It depends on how the mortgage paperwork breaks down, but I don't want to get into the weeds on this. So let's break this down fundamentally so you can understand on paper. So the first thing you have when people give a loan is the security interest. The next one is basically a note. We'll explain that. You have the deed. We'll explain that. And then you have the foreclosure process. So let's break this down. So security means if I give you money for a property, how am I protected if you don't pay me back? Great question. This is the number one question whenever someone goes into a financial arrangement in real estate. This is why real estate's so attractive by a bank. That's why there's trillions of dollars on the books, because real estate is securitized. What does that mean? It's simple. In a judicial state, to do a security, they issue a mortgage. The mortgage is recorded on public record, and here's how it works. When you hear about first lien, second lien, first position, second position, it's simple. Whoever time stamps and dates the recording gets priority. So if I record a mortgage 1 minute before yours, it is in a first position. A lot of people think it's based on the amount. It's not. It's whoever records first. Most people want to be in a first position. That's how you're 100% protected. I've been in second and third positions, and if there's no equity left and it goes to foreclosure, you don't get paid. Now, you can pursue the debtor, but odds are you're probably going to be waiting a long time to get paid. That's why it's so important when a bank issues you a mortgage and funds it, they in exchange record a mortgage and then they have a note on you. So the next one is going to be the note. Who gets the note? The note's issued from the bank. You're going to get a copy of the note. The bank has a copy and it's on record. I'm just going to put a yes. So there's going to be a note and a mortgage. The mortgage secures a lien against the property, depending on the timing of the position. Most banks want to be in the first. And then in exchange, they get a note. And the note is a promissory to make a payment. That note also involves you personally guaranteeing it. So in the event the property gets foreclosed on and there's not enough to cover it, they can chase you down for a judgment. And so not only are they guaranteeing it with the asset, but you're personally guaranteeing it. This is why banks give loans. So if you understand that, in a judicial state, who gets the deed? The homeowner gets the deed. Now, everybody thinks everything stops at the deed. A deed is just proof you own this home, period. Like, a deed is proof. It doesn't mean it's right. It's just proof of ownership. That's it. So he or she who owns the deed usually has the upper hand. This is what happens in a judicial state. Now, the foreclosure process, if you default on the loan and stop making payments, you are going to go through a court system for foreclosure. Now, judicial means this process is going to take longer. So if you guys ever done anything legally, it's painful and it's long and it's drawn out. What's the average procedure? The minimum is 6 months, but a lot of times it can be up to 24 to even 36 months. Depending on the complexity of the case. That's it. That's a judicial state. Don't worry. As soon as I'm done with this graphic, I'm going to show you which state you're in, and you can Google it. It's super simple. Now, non-judicial, they still give loans in non-judicial states. In fact, non-judicial is more predominant than judicial. So how does this work? This is where the terminology gets really messed up, and this is where confusion's created. I don't know if it's created from gurus. I know it's created by lawyers, and when you talk to title companies, you feel overwhelmed. So the security interest in a non-judicial state is really simple. It's called a deed of trust. I know the word deed is extremely misleading. It's annoying. It has nothing to do with like a traditional deed like you think. Think a deed of trust like mortgage. It's what they record to make sure they're in the right position so they get repaid the debt owed to the bank. End of story. It's not like a regular deed. I don't know why they come up with this terminology. I believe people in the finance world try to make things more complex to confuse people like you and me. The more confused you are, the more you submit and the more you pay. This is my opinion. So the same thing's going to do on creating a note. And then here's where it gets interesting. When it comes to the deed, think about this. When you buy a car and you finance it, do you get a copy of the title? The title is the same thing as the deed. The answer is no. So if you finance it, basically the bank or a third party holds on to it. And once you fulfill all your payments, then the title gets mailed to you. That's how a non-judicial state works in basic terms. Why do you need to know all this? Number one, I want you to understand what you're doing. And number two, I want you to know what you're up against. So when it comes to the deed, a third party is going to hold this until you fulfill your end of the obligation. That protects their interest. That's how they do it non-judicial. Remember, this is more predominant than judicial states. Now, here's where it gets interesting. They don't have to go to court to take the property back. What does that mean? It's a faster process for foreclosure. What's the average time frame? I've seen it as little as 3 months to usually at the maximum like 9 to 12 months. Every state's a little bit different, every case. I'm just telling you, in a non-judicial state, the foreclosure process goes much faster. Why do you need to know this? Because you're going to have to understand the difference between a mortgage, a deed of trust, and who controls the deed. If you don't know the difference, you're going to get stuck. So let's flip over. I want to show you a graphic so you can easily identify which state you're investing in to do creative financing so you know the difference between judicial and non-judicial. So if you look up on the screen, you can quickly identify which type of state you're doing it in. And this even gets more confusing. Some states are a combination of both. I don't get into the laws on this, but identify your state so you know. The judicial states, to me, it's a little bit easier. It's much clearer. That's why I love Florida. But when we do this all over the country, you have to know what you're dealing with. So now you know how to talk when you're talking to title companies, lawyers, and other people. So you understand if you're going to write a note, you're going to do something creative financing, who records, what's the foreclosure process, who gets a mortgage, who gets a deed of trust. This just simplifies it. Find your state on there. I'm going to leave it up just for a second and you can just pause it during this video and find out, or you can just Google it. It's not over that complicated, but it's much easier in judicial. I find non-judicial and a combo of both. You have to get clarity through a title company or a real estate lawyer. So now that we know the basics, let's talk about the 3 simple options to do most creative financing structures. And don't get me wrong, guys, there's a lot more to this. I'm teaching you the basic mechanics so you understand how to take them down. So technique number 1 is called subject to, and I'm gonna go ahead and share it on the screen for you. I kind of pre-wrote it up there. Subject to is just the art of taking over someone's current obligations. That's it, meaning it's subject to the existing debt on the property, which means you're gonna take over the terms of the mortgage, you have to make the payments on time, and you have to comply with the lender. There are conditions when you take over a bank loan, and all you are is taking their place. Now let's talk about the types of deals that are perfect for a subject to. And this is 101 type of stuff. But number one, on a subject to, your typical one, not all of them, is low equity. Let me give you an example. Say somebody bought a property a year ago, they put down 3%, and maybe the property's flat or has gone backwards in value. And for them to sell it, they have to basically list it with a realtor, pay closing costs, and a lot of times they gotta bring 20 or 30 grand to the table. This is the most popular one that you're gonna deal with subject to. Most of these types are gonna be wind up in some sort of pre-foreclosure process. Now, I like to catch them when they're early because you have options. If you catch them at the end, it's a nightmare. If you want to learn all about the pre-foreclosure process and how these types of sellers operate, go over to freewholesaling.com. I teach it in more detail. These people also are ones that need money to close, meaning they're short. Why? It's going to be like realtor fees, closing fees. Some of them aren't in foreclosure, but they just can't sell. Maybe somebody got transferred with a job. Maybe somebody got relocated in a military position, and instead of, they got a VA loan with 3% down, but they got to come up with 10% to sell it. They don't have 20, 30 grand. These are the types of people that you want to help out with subject to. Now, keep in mind, not every one of these candidates are a great creative financing deal. One of the basic terms of creative financing for a subject to, you got to have monthly cash flow. Why? Because expenses go up on a house. Insurance, the taxes go up. Sometimes there's some repairs built into the house, although that's their obligation, but there's got to be enough cash flow to cover it in case you have to replace your end buyer on the property. If there's no cash flow, there's no incentive to stay in the deal, and it's very taxing. Nobody wants to service a creative financing deal with zero income per month. Even if you make some money up front at the end, there's a lot of risk in the middle if there's no cash flow. Cash flow cures a lot of things. Without cash flow, creative financing deals can be tough. Remember, I don't want you to do a creative financing deal to say, I did a creative financing deal. If you can't make money, what's the point? We have to minimize our risk. If there's no cash flow, seriously consider if you want to move this deal forward. One of my favorite types of sellers are people who want to just leave. And what do I mean? They leave the country, they have a major life change. I get a lot of people with midlife crisis. When they want to leave the country, subject twos are beautiful. Now, one thing I'm going to tell you about some of the risks with subject twos. And I don't want to get into the weeds on legalities of it. I'm trying to make you understand the simplicity of subject twos. Subject twos work if it works for you. The cash flow's there. You and the seller are 100% cooperative. I know you're going to be, but sometimes sellers, you can't make them do these deals. In fact, most of the time a subject to, you are the best deal. They've tried it with a realtor. They've tried it with a wholesaler. They've tried everything else. You are the only fit because they got so many conditions and you're the only one that can be flexible enough to adapt to it. A wholesaler has to cash it out. A realtor has to put it on the market and go through that dance. You are the most flexible one, and this is why they're attractive. So let's talk about some of the risks on these. A lot of people talk about the due on sale. Honestly, it's way overplayed. I've done a lot of these deals. I've had multiple ones called. I have options to figure it out. In the beginning, you don't have options. So if you get a due on sale clause, don't panic. You still have time to get rid of the property. It's not like you got 30 days to get it done. But basically, when you change title, you do run the risk of the banks finding out. And I'm telling you, with AI here in the future, I think it's going to be more predominant. But as long as the bank gets their monthly payment, they usually don't care. Sometimes they get an itch. Sometimes it's a really low interest rate and they're high interest rates. They might call a due on sale clause if they find out something was done or recorded. So remember, when you record something, that's what triggers it. The next thing is you have to actually read the mortgage. Nobody ever seems to talk about this. Mortgage have conditions. So you need to thoroughly read it. Either have your title company read it, have a lawyer read it for you. An example, if they've ever done a loan modification, it specifically usually requires the homeowner has to live in the property for X amount of time during the loan mod. So if they did a loan mod and they failed and you take over a subject to and you're not aware of this condition, you could be violating the mortgage. It's going to trigger the due on sale clause and it's going to create all sorts of problems. So I always find out if they're in a loan mod and I see what the restrictions. The loan mod is an additional addendum to the mortgage. Make sure you know the terms on the mortgage. So this is going to be interest rate, length of loan. And this is the big one, guys. The length of the loan is huge. You've got to understand this. If you are new to creative financing, your best friend is time. So long as you have cash flow, when you get in on the deal, you have monthly cash flow and you have an exit plan, a lot of people try to play around with the terms. So your average mortgage is going to be 30 years, right? So a lot of people, they're 2 to 3 years into a mortgage, there's 27 years left on it. And somehow somebody taught you guys, what if I take it over and I cash it out in 3 years? I know you think 3 years is a long time. It's not. So many things can happen. If you have not learned over the last 5 years that there's so many things outside of our control that don't happen, stop asking for 3 years. The minimum I will do any type of creative financing deal for, my basic requirement is I always try to go for 60 months. It sounds longer. 60 is a big number as opposed to 3. So 60 months is 5 years. So the reality is that's my bare minimum. Why? Because I want time. The more time you have, the more options you have. The less time you have, things can go south on you real quick. Sometimes you have to exchange the end user on the property. Sometimes you're just renting it. Sometimes the person doesn't perform and you got to find a new buyer. 3 years is extremely short. And you have to go back to the seller and you have to renegotiate or get an extension. You want more time. So think about wholesaling. I always tell you, I go, in a perfect world, I would ask for 90 days. The reality is most of you are getting 30 days. This is the same scenario. Now, here's the key, guys. If there's 27 years left on the mortgage, that's what I go for. Why? It creates more value in the deal because I have longer financing terms and it works best for you. Not every seller is going to go for it. They have conditions for it, but try to go for the maximum amount on the loan because it gives you more options. It'll allow you to leverage the property better and you're going to make better cash flow, in my opinion. If you do this 3 years because you had to cave on your terms, you better be getting one heck of a deal and you better have a backup plan when you have to cash it out. So make sure you understand the terms and the length of the loan. It is a big one. Now we're talking about risk. So we talked about the due on sale clause. We talked about the length of the loan. I will tell you this, one of the big ones on these is the insurance. It's a pain in the butt. Remember, the bank gave a loan to the homeowner. You're taking it over. So most people try to get themselves named as the additional insured on the insurance policy. This can trigger all sorts of problems. One of the ways that we work around it, we just go and get our own insurance policy on top of it. Sometimes it's just easier. It is a fight. And remember, they're only going to communicate to your seller until you transfer title. Sometimes you can't transfer title and you got to understand that. Now, let's talk about the closing. Here's the truth, guys. The title company. If you take a traditional deal like a subject to a title company, they're going to look at you like you got 3 heads. Most typical realtor title companies, they don't want to do deals with subject to because they don't want to write the title policy. They don't want to insure a previous debt. In fact, most of them will avoid doing it. Now, there's special title companies that work with investors. You don't always need a title company to do these. This is why I create a financing. You can do a tabletop closing, which we do all the time. But I'm here to tell you, when you take this to your traditional title company, don't be shocked if they say no. They don't like to underwrite this. A lot of title companies, the creative ones that you work with wholesaling, will write an exception to this. But I'm just saying this is a much larger scale hunt if you want to use a traditional title company. Just be aware of that. So guys, this is the basics of a subject to deal. And I want you to understand they are wonderful when they work out. But here's the key is make sure you're never forcing it. Make sure you are the best fit for them. And if you help the seller out and you give them solutions to the problem, creative financing on a subject to is amazing. Just understand some of the hiccups you have to deal with. This is a conversation between you and the seller, and you both work out what works out best for you. Your job as the creative financing person is once you understand the terms and you have clear communication, now you have to take your deal to someone that will take it down. Now, when it comes to the paperwork to these, I'm here to tell you, every state's a little bit different. I strongly advise you work with your title company and I suggest you work with your title company and a real estate lawyer to get the paperwork that complies for your state. When we talk about non-judicial and judicial, it's important that you don't have a simple cookie cut template because it doesn't always mean it's going to work in every state. You have to understand that. So let's move on to technique number 2. So in a subject to, I will tell you this, is you have to establish trust because you are taking on somebody else's debt. So in a subject to, understand this, that loan's still in their name. So we have to talk about that is on the subject to, you've have to establish trust because they are taking a huge faith in you. But what happens when they don't trust you? Let's face it, we are strangers when we first meet them. Even though if you hit a great conversation, you're still a stranger. And that means stranger danger. Like, so how do we deal with people that don't trust us? Or like, how do I know you're going to live up to your end of the bargain? So technique number 2 is all about explaining that, and it's simple. Now, I'm going to give you a vanilla generic term that's used all across the country because this is where everything gets really confusing in creative financing. So options number 2 is when we need to establish trust. And what do I mean by that? At this point, they say, listen, Rick, I love what you're saying. It sounds almost too good to be true. How do I know I can trust you to follow through on that? Great answer. And I have a solution for you. It's real simple. It's called an executory contract. Now, this is a name that's given to by the courts. I don't own this name, nobody does, but it's commonly known. An executed contract is the opposite. Everything's completed and it's absolutely done. So an example of an executory contract, depending on what state you're in, it can be a simple lease, it can be an option, it can be a land contract, it can be a contract for deed, it can be a simple rental agreement, it can be installment payments. This is it. Executory is just a fancy word that covers all these different names depending on what state you're in. It's ridiculous. There's a ton of them, too many for me to even name. I just want you to understand an executory contract means both parties have to live up to their obligations. And until they're executed in full, it's executory. Give you an example is I make monthly payments. As long as I make my monthly payments to you, when it's completed, then the deed gets exchanged. So what's the purpose of an executory contract? So remember, the names are going to be very different in every state. I implore you to find out what the legal terminology of an executory contract in your state is. Here's the key difference on these types of deals. An executory serves as a main function. Number one, in my opinion, you establish trust. Why? Because if I skip out on the payments, what's the damage? I don't get the rights to the property. So if I make 30 payments on time and then I skip the next 2, I don't get credit for those 30 payments, and the person already has the deed and they're in control and I'm wiped out. Now they've got to follow what the contract is, and that's why I want you guys to talk to a real estate lawyer and your title company to make sure you're using the right paperwork in your state. Remember, using a boiler type creative financing for all states is a really bad idea. We establish trust. Why? Because you're not giving me the deed. Here's the beauty of it. The seller controls the deed. The buyer makes payments in exchange for contractual control of the property. Hope this is making sense. But what happens is the deed is over here and the agreement's here. And here's the beauty of it. This is why it works so well, and it's an amazing tool. Basically, the deed's held in private, meaning it's basically sits in a lawyer's office. It can sit in a safe, whatever it is, or it's held by a third party. Once you fulfill your end of the obligation, then the deed gets swapped to you. They sign off on it and you're good to go. Why does this work? Because the reality is people don't know what you're doing. How does this work real well on? I will tell you this. HOAs are a nightmare. If you guys know about HOAs, they have priority position whenever it comes to a lien, and you got to be aware of it. I don't need to tell you about banks. And often banks are the same thing as lenders, and it makes it really challenging. So also it allows you to implement a strategy with nobody else kind of really knowing about it. So I've used this technique to buy multiple properties in a neighborhood. So one doesn't pit me against the other. They go, hey man, he's buying everything. Let's just charge him more. You're able to hide the material fact of what's happening. It's 100% legal. Executory contracts, find out which ones work in your state. I love using them. They're very confusing in all the different states. And even I get help on this. I'm not an expert on this. I know how to talk to sellers. I know what fits. So an executory contract will bridge the trust issue that you have with someone who's like, how do I know you're going to do what you do? Executory contract simplifies it, meaning the deed's held in private and it's not put on public record. So it doesn't trigger a due on sale clause. It doesn't trigger any type of suspicion, and it's 100% legal. Now, I want you to understand the only risk that I find with executory contracts, and we have to talk about the risk, is what happens when someone files bankruptcy in it. Uh-oh. I will tell you, every state treats executory contracts differently. So this is the only risk you run to it. If your seller enters into bankruptcy, your executory contract is going to be looked under the scope of the microscope of the trustees in the bankruptcy. And if you have not executed everything you're supposed to do on this contract, it could be considered null and void. I've had this happen to me, and I'm telling you, this is why you got to get the right paperwork and you need a lawyer to look it over, because if you don't execute it, and by the way, if you don't meet all the terms of the executory contract, your state's bankruptcy or the federal government consider it null and void. They're all over the board about this, and this is the only downside I see in executory contracts. So make sure you have a legal agreement, you have endorsed by a title company, a lawyer, and you make sure you follow it to a T. If you do that, it should survive bankruptcy. But if you got a wild loosey-goosey one and nobody's making payments payments on time like that, don't be surprised if it gets discharged in bankruptcy, which means they won't recognize it, which means it's unenforceable. So that's the only downside. Executory contract works very well. All I want you to understand is the basic mechanics of it so you can utilize this tool. So that moves us on to tech number 3, which is simply what we call owner financing. And you're thinking like, well, Rick, what's the difference in it? It's simple. Your seller basically winds up being the bank. What? Yes. Let me give you an example. Most of the people I deal with owner financing are older landlords. Sometimes they're tired landlords. And here's what they want. They always seem to want a certain price target number. And guess what? Nobody wants to meet it. Wholesalers never meet it. Realtors can't meet it. So these properties tend to sit on the market for a long time. And most of these people, they're usually financially well off. They're very happy with their situation. They just kind of want to get rid of this property. Your job is to find out what they need to get rid of it. They typically want that dollar amount. Why we're so attractive to them? Because we can give them that dollar amount in exchange for the right terms. It's that simple. So what I'm going to try to do is convince them to be the bank. How do I do that? Well, let's think about what are their problems. Tenants. They get headaches. Repairs. Uncertainty. Held captive by market conditions. Meaning when they sell it, sometimes the market doesn't bear what they believe it's worth. And that's why these properties get stuck. And honestly, they just get tired of it. They have plenty of money. They don't need to sell it to a wholesaler. They're not going to bend to the realtor's commissions and take huge deductions. They turn down all inspections to counter for a counter offer. And so we come across a lot of these properties. So basically what we want to do is say, listen, what if I could show you how I could give you the same monthly cash flow, avoid a tax issue. A lot of these people, their investment properties, they don't want to take a big tax gain. Maybe they got other business making a lot of money and they want to defer it, right? We'll call that deferring. Big selling point with them. This will wind up being passive income for them, being the bank. They get certainty and they're not subject to market conditions. Basically, you can go to the beach, drink your Mai Tais. The cash is coming every month. You don't have to deal and worry about tenants trashing the place, rents changing, market prices changing. In exchange, you get a monthly check. Does that sound attractive to you? Most of them absolutely love it. I'm just selling them on becoming from a landlord to the bank. And once you open up to it, they never really thought about this. Okay, why would they do this? I want you to think about this. So on owner financing, I promise you, you're going to have to solve the trust issue. So we told you how to solve the trust issue with an executory contract. You don't need an executory contract for this. This is actually, to me, one of the clearest ways to do a deal, and it's one of the easiest ones to communicate to a seller. Number one, you're going to record a mortgage or a deed of trust, depending on what state you're in. What does that do? That's the seller's security right there. Okay, if you want to talk to a rich landlord, they want to know how their capital is protected, you instantly protect there. Number two, you're going to sign a promissory note. Now, most of them are going to ask for a personal guarantee. We call it a PG. Sometimes you can do it with your business. It's negotiable. Like, don't lose a deal over this. If you're going to buy a deal, make sure you live up to it and get it done. Also, they're going to save closing costs, avoid realtor fees, and here's the best part. Speed. You don't have to wait 45 days to do it. You can actually do it in a very short amount of time. This is clear, it's precise, and here's the beauty for you guys. You can take this to your traditional title company and they can easily do this deal. In fact, your title company will help with the mortgage and the note. I still recommend you have a lawyer review it. But guys, this is how creative financing works when it comes to owner financing. You're just convincing the owner of the property, usually the landlord, to become the bank. They never really thought about this. Remember, your job is to stimulate a resourceful conversation, to show them a technique nobody else has showed them. And once you do it, your job is to let them know that it's going to be a win-win situation. And if they want to take it down, I want to move forward. I never shove this down their mouth. I make it super simple. So guys, in this video, we've gone over 3 basic techniques to break down creative financing. Number 1, the subject to. Number 2, executory contracts. And number 3, owner financing. Are there additional ones? Absolutely. The list goes on and on, but these are the 3 fundamental things you need to understand to take down any creative financing deal. And remember, in the beginning, we break down the simplest terms of how creative financing's explained, operated, and done. It's important you understand the terms of creative financing so you understand the difference between a deed of a trust and a deed and a mortgage, due on sale clause, and all these fancy terms, because most people try to talk over our heads. Simplify it. Go back and review this video. And what we're going to do is, in the final series, the 3rd one, is we are going to talk about how to connect with the seller to make a presentation and talk to them about creative financing. So guys, if you got value from this video, do me a favor, make sure you smash that like button, hit that subscribe button, and I will see you in series number 3 on creative financing, on how to talk to the sellers. This is Rick, and I'll see you guys soon.